Hello, welcome everyone, wherever you're joining us for today's webinar. My name is Alexander Love and I'm a Senior Editor for Global Data. I'm just going to introduce you to our platform before I hand you over to your host. We're very pleased to have you attend today to discuss the topic Unlock Insights with NLP-enhanced EHR and claims data. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar platform. This webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect, please click the link you received via email to rejoin the session. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so using the Q&A widget on the platform. We'll try and get through as many of your questions as we can once the presentations have ended. Please use the help widget if you experience any technical difficulties or require any more assistance. And please use the related content box to access any additional resources. Today's webinar is brought to you by MarketScan by Merative. I would now like to hand you over to your moderator for today's event, Lisa Palmer, who is Portfolio Leader of World Data Research and Analytics at MarketScan. Lisa will also introduce you to your expert speakers for this webinar. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Alex. As many of you know, February is American Heart Month, so we are excited to spend the next hour exploring how real-world data can be used to advance cardiovascular research. In today's session, we will talk through how financial data in combination with NLP-enhanced EMR data augments the analysis of cardiovascular outcomes. I'm particularly happy to introduce today's speakers, Luc Belanger and Mac Bonafide, as I've worked closely with both of them for many, many years. Luc Belanger is an academically trained health economist specializing in health outcomes and health economics research for upwards of 29 years, with a focus on the design, implementation, and dissemination of real-world observational studies. He is currently a director on the product team for the MarketScan research databases, where he applies his expertise in acquiring, linking, managing, and analyzing data from multiple sources. Mac Bonafide leads up the real-world evidence function at Veradigm. His team handles all of their real-world data analyses, both retrospective and prospective, using their internal EHR and registry databases, as well as unique data assets like the one we've built and will be discussing today. Mac started out in academia and still adjuncts in the Health Management and Policy Department at the University of New Hampshire. I will now turn it over to the speakers, Luc and Mac.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'll just get started. I'm going to start by talking about at least the core claims part of this great link set that we're going to talk to you about today. The claims, come from MarketScan, specifically the commercial and Medicare databases that are part of the family of databases of MarketScan. It's important to note kind of the sourcing of the claims databases, because I'm sure you've seen other, claims, EHR or claims and clinical data kind of products out there. And, we feel like this one's differentiated for many reasons. One is the core claims database. That's the backbone of it, which is MarketScan. It's sourced from large self-insured employers. And that really brings sort of a lot of advantages to the data set itself. It's a great backbone, as we're referring to it here. It's also a great kind of almost like a palette that you can kind of paint on, bringing in various other types of data sources linked to it, as we've seen over the years. And we have our commercial and Medicare sets, as I said before, and they have a lot of advantages because of the nature of the sourcing from the large self-insured employers. One being longitudinality. We can follow patients throughout their employment tenure, as well as their families, their spouses, and their children. We see, folks who change benefit plans or insurance companies year over year. We see people that stay with the same health insurance company. We see people whose employers change, the options on them. So it's actually, if you think about it, from a closed claims perspective, a pretty turbulent process that one goes through in the U.S. anyways, in sort of choosing their health insurance for themselves and their families through their employer. And the way we source MarketScan is we kind of fly above that turbulence, in that we can follow people from their choices, or perhaps the choices that were made for them by their employers, from time to time. So patient longitudinality is really big in the data set. We also are able to offer a data set that looks at really a heterogeneous payer mix. We source MarketScan from about 350 separate employers, as well as some medium-sized to large health plans as well that are in there. Each of these employers are pretty big companies. They offer multiple choices for health insurance to their employees and for their families. And so when you put it all together, we have lots of different dozens and dozens of health plans in MarketScan, and it's really a nice representative picture of that commercial insurance marketplace. And then finally, behind the scenes, we're putting together very, very complete, almost research-grade databases amongst themselves for these individual employers. And those are the pieces, sort of the bricks that go into making MarketScan. These are very complete sources of information because the companies use this information for their important decision making. And one of the factors, obviously, is cost, let's face it. And so because of that, we're able to bring you actual payments in most cases as part of MarketScan. And that's kind of our final, sort of one of the advantages that we have as well in MarketScan is that we have actual financial costs, most of the time. So MarketScan is one of the claims databases, one of the few really that you can really span between your safety and epi type studies because we have complete information in the data set. We have denominators and very complete information all the way spanning across, obviously, the regulatory studies, as well as your health economic analyses, because we have the actual financial costs. So it really runs the gamut there, that distribution of studies that one likes to do with a complete source. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Mac to talk about the Veradigm source.
Cool, thank you, Luke. So Veradigm, just by way of background, owns and operates a couple different EHR systems. So, today's discussion is mostly around what we can do with the de-identified data that comes out of these technology platforms. It's always important to start from the basis of a purpose behind an EHR. So an EHR is intended to facilitate the delivery and documentation of healthcare. So much as I hate to admit it, the EHR system doesn't just exist to facilitate research like mine. But we're fortunate as kind of the data originators, as like the owners of that technology platform, that we can interact with that EHR platform, and we own and build and maintain the subsequent data factory that facilitates both better patient care and better real world evidence generation. Kind of owning that whole process is really important. But for perspective, our primary customers are healthcare providers. Their goal is to provide better healthcare. This perspective is important because it answers the why for everything that Veradigm does. Why do we do this? We do this to improve the delivery of healthcare. And the figure above shows some of the common data elements in our EHR databases. So think about when you walk into your provider, when you talk to them, when you meet with them, what happens? These reflect a capture of who the patient is, things like demographics, some social determinants of health data, health behaviors, race, ethnicity, alongside all the clinical details, what brought you there, your vitals, your medical history, your immunization records, patient-reported outcomes, procedures, medications, everything in that visit, all of the things that go into capturing what happens in an ambulatory care visit. We need a data bucket or a place for each one of these so that we can accommodate our full provider mix. Our EHRs it's all ambulatory, but it's about 50-50, PCP and specialist with coverage in all 50 states. So we need a spot for everything. And as a data originator, everything comes to us in its natural form. And then our data factory makes it research ready for our internal and external users. And if you've heard me give a talk like this before, I'm always quick to say I have the best job at Veradigm because my team gets to be the first users of this really cool data in this really cool data sandbox. And this linked data is no different. It's a privilege to get to be one of the first users of it. Luke?
That sounds great. And so, and obviously the purpose of this call is to talk about that link source, that Mac was just talking about. So we're happy to have this linked MarketScan Veradigm data set. As I mentioned to you before, MarketScan is kind of providing the backbone, sort of the framework, of that closed claims system. It's very complete and so forth, and has all the advantages that we mentioned. Veradigm is bringing in all of the EHR components to provide that deep dive in the clinical picture. So you can do lots of different studies with this, as we'll talk about on the next slide. And And sort of this is sort of our gaps that we feel like we're kind of filling with Best Link Claims EHR product. So if you think about it from a closed claims perspective, you have all kinds of information on complete, these days. I date back to ICD-9 times, but we have complete information from the ICD-10 diagnosis codes clearly in all of the complete records we have in the claims. But think about it, on an EHR data set like Veradigm has much more detail than that in terms of the SNOMED codes and some of the other factors. So you can look at some of the more detailed clinical context with the SNOMED codes and perhaps compare that to the visits that you're seeing with the fully adjudicated claims with the ICD-10 codes to get a little more context in terms of perhaps why the patient is visiting the doctor or using the healthcare system. We have all kinds of healthcare encounters. It's a closed claims perspective at MarketScan. We're capturing inpatient, outpatient, dispensed pharmacy, and sort of a lot of things in between as part of the data set. But you can get some of the clinical information, especially the lab results and the vital signs and so forth from Veradigm that basically provides more detail and more context as part of those visits. We're looking at the resource utilization from an outpatient pharmacy fills perspective in MarketScan. And again, you can look at, for example, you go to the doctor, you see a hypertension diagnosis. Okay, well, maybe that's a rule-out diagnosis. Maybe it's a real diagnosis that's causing an issue. Then you go into Veradigm, you can actually look up vital signs, for those blood pressure values that were taken at that visit and really put more context behind it in terms of perhaps there was a medication prescribed and dispensed after that or whatnot. All kinds of stuff you can do with that, with lab tests and so forth. And then, there's obviously all kinds of issues when someone is in MarketScan. You're going to see the dispensed medications, what someone actually fills, and you can do a pretty good job of linking that to the outpatient visit. But with Veradigm, you actually get very detailed information in terms of the prescriber and the reason for diagnosis as part of those visits. And you can sync up the prescribed medication and look at some analyses in terms of what was eventually dispensed, how much time was in between, and the turbulence that goes along with that process sometimes to look at issues and then look ahead at outcomes, depending on what you see. And then, as we mentioned before, MarketScan has a lot of, actual cost information in terms of procedures and medications. And the exciting thing about Veradigm, and you'll see a little bit later, in terms of the NLP that's applied anyways, we can get additional insights, not just on the vitals and sort of the blood and urine lab results, but also from assessments and other things that they can kind of dig out of the notes, using natural language processing. I don't know if Mac, if you had anything else to add to this one.
Yeah, one thing I really like about it is the high degree of data fidelity back to our source data. I mean, we put a lot of thought into the data model so we can tell where it came from so that you can actually quantify. I like that term, Luke. I hadn't heard you use it before, but turbulence, the turbulence between what we see in the clinician and what we see from the payer. But it's important that we both organically developed the shared data model. We both came to the table with what we wanted to keep and preserve for that data fidelity so that I know if I see a data element in there, I'm confident it came straight from a clinical practice. I can track it all the way through to preserve that clinical depth. I mean, we've had a lot of really smart people put a lot of thought and effort into this data model to make sure it does everything we want it to do to be research ready.
Thanks, Mac, and I'll turn it over to you to talk about NLP.
With pleasure. So thank you. This slide outlines kind of the features in our process for converting unstructured clinical data into structured, neat, tidy, usable data elements using natural language processing. Excuse me. And we use kind of a mix of machine learning and rules-based approaches. I will admit this is not my area of expertise. I am the first consumer and user of this, but not the actual doer of it. So this is by design a highly collaborative and multidisciplinary approach. I heard on the radio this morning somebody referred to both a development that's both intervention is both high tech and high touch, and I feel like that applies here. It's high tech and high touch. So the starting point is unstructured data, as you see in the left. Whether that's SOAP notes, chief complaints, observations. For the purposes of today, I'm going to kind of lump it all into one bucket. It's unstructured stuff that we need to structure, or the term that makes my team groan is when I say structureize it. it's all the stuff that the doctor captures in your appointment. We use NLP to create structured data that we can then append to our ambulatory EHR database so it can be used by a research team. We have to get it into the same data table structure, but sitting alongside it so you can tell what came from a note versus what came from like a LOINC code or a lab that came in. At the end of the process, we have structured data from these rich unstructured sources that fits within our stat cert to remain de-identified. That's vital. It has to be usable. It has to be shippable. It has to be able to stand on its own and be used in a HIPAA compliant way. And an important distinction here is the free text never leaves Veradigm, and frankly, never even reaches my RWE team. All this happens in a production environment to keep our privacy safeguards intact, so we can look at the notes, get insights out of the notes, but still use it for research. At Veradigm, I'm extremely fortunate. We have an awesome team of data scientists. We have an awesome team of clinicians led by Jordan Overcash, who work with this raw data to structure, but they also have the clinical knowledge to make sure it makes sense. I mean, I feel like high tech is easy and high touch is easy, but doing it together is really hard. And Jordan's team is second to none at that. So, you can imagine, talk about hallucinations, like a note saying a patient's spouse had COVID. We don't want that to result in a COVID diagnosis. We want it to result in a COVID exposure diagnosis versus a patient self-swabbing for COVID results in a COVID diagnosis, whether they have a diagnosis or not. Running a model that looks for that distinction and make sure it's coded correctly in the data. It's a really basic example, but having a human at the switch to check the accuracy of the model and having ruthlessly high standards for accuracy, make sure we don't apply that COVID diagnosis to the wrong person. The end product is a structured data table that we can use right alongside all of our other research elements. And I'll show you some concrete examples of that in a minute, but this may sound trivial, but this is the strong foundation. It's the backbone for how we work with all of our unstructured stuff. But as we just showed 2 slides ago with the 2 different colors, it's an additional component. It's an additional element that sits alongside all of the great cost and administrative data fidelity that you guys have. We can bring to the unstructured stuff as well. So now I'm going to read each one of these bullets to you one by one. This is a lot of words. I'm not going to go into any or most of these at all. At Veradigm, what we typically do is go therapeutic area by therapeutic area to pick which measures we want to structure next. I think one of our first ones was BMI. We did that a few years back. It seemed like real low-hanging fruit. It's mostly a structured field, but every once in a while it would appear in unstructured text. And we've been expanding since then, getting better and faster every time. I'm coming up on my 5th year, and the cadence with which we can turn these out is like light years faster. So we base the priority list on what we see in here in our little RWD world. So no, I don't get to pick all of the priorities, but I do get a vote, which is pretty cool. A personal interest, back in my Truven days, we did an awful lot of research in multiple sclerosis. So if you look kind of in the upper right there, or mid right, the addition of EDSS out of unstructured data is extremely exciting. We used to come up with different proxies, different claims-based algorithms for it. So to have it and to be able to validate it together, I haven't said this to Luke and Lisa, but that's something we'd love to do, start to validate some of those claims-based algorithms. Same for MMSE or MoCA. Having these elements readily available just enables better, deeper research. But I want to point out, we've used this approach that we showed on the prior slide. We have here some numbers for harder elements, not just these kind of simple ones. We've used it for things like disease severity. We've used it for presence of flares. We've done some work on like lupus and atopic derm, psoriasis, those types of things where we're looking at more qualitative concepts of severity or flares. Or, because schizophrenia, we've looked for like negative symptoms. We want to tackle positive symptoms next. These are harder concepts to put to structure because they require meaning and context, or kind of scaling rather than just kind of a numeric endpoint. We also can use this to look for additional diagnoses or exposures, which is huge for safety studies. Most of that admittedly does happen in a custom research project, but it follows the same process we talked about above. This often could map us to a specific diagnosis code, or to be honest, more often a SNOMED concept or code. It just gives us a lot more clinical depth in the response range. As I just said a second ago, the measure doesn't have to map back to a single number or numeric scale, like Mini-Mental or the EDSS. It could map to a concept like you had a flare, your disease was severe, you had an adverse event, you had an exposure and an outcome. Those types of concepts are fair game as well. This is what's really important about this is it's a moving target. We like to say, once you've developed a model and run it once, you run a model once. You need to update and iterate. So ejection fraction, I think, was probably the second or third one we do. And every time we do it, we get a little bit better. And the world changes as well in 5 years or in 6 months or even 1 year. Physicians are changing how they code things. So HCP documentation evolves over time. So we're constantly reassessing and repeating what we're looking for and how we're looking for it. What I think the next kind of riddle we're trying to solve and actively doing in a few spots is answering why. And this is where things get really, really exciting and really, really complicated. Why did a patient discontinue medication? I think if we polled the group and said, a patient's on a chronic medication, what's persistence at a year? The pessimists would say 25%, the optimists would say 40%, but nobody would say 80%. Why did a patient discontinue medication? Why did a patient switch therapies? Did you stop your chronic medication because of an adverse event that maybe wasn't quite bad enough to get entered as a diagnosis on the claim, was bad enough to note as a symptom? Did you then go to an urgent care center that your PCP might not care about, that I can't see, but maybe your health insurance does know about it, but we didn't make the connection between the two. So that's where the connection between the clinical depth that we have and the full, complete, comprehensive gold standard utilization record is absolutely vital. And this extraction of meaning, the why. Why did this happen? Why did we see this pattern? That's where we're moving next. It's often on a case-by-case basis, but that's the next layer for this approach and really holds kind of some of our biggest healthcare challenges. Okay, I'm probably going to say this on multiple slides, but this is my favorite slide in the deck. This shows the relative we just picked a handful, and we didn't pick all perfect ones, of clinical measures that we often care about and often try to apply NLP to show what was the lift we get. So we get structured fields. We can get your CRP in a structured field in the EHR. But what we find is that, you get a 45.5% lift by looking into the unstructured field in a notes. Not surprisingly, there are a couple elements that are captured really well natively in the EHR. BMI and race don't actually help that much from NLP. It's actually captured pretty well in a structured field. I'll actually say in the 5 years I've been here, I've seen a better capture of these in the structured field over time. We're gradually getting more and more in better capture. For some of these elements, the capture through NLP is just massive. I think this figure caps out at 100%. I know a couple of these are like 1,000%. There are some elements that just don't get captured in structured fields right now. Lots of these live exclusively in the notes or the unstructured text. But this makes sense if you think about it from the perspective of an ambulatory EHR system that covers all types of providers in all 50 states and all types of patients. Several of these are tests that come back to the HCP. HCP gets the result, and they might document it into the chart, but it might be as a narrative, it might be as a discussion, it might be as a phone call, it might be a nurse follow-up. There's 100 different ways they get that knowledge from the test that came back to them, and it gets logged as part of the patient discussion. We look in all those different spots to structure it, put into one nice, neat, tidy table so you know exactly where it is and exactly what it is. Again, we can also get LOINC codes coming back in, which is great if your HCP orders one of these kind of advanced cardiovascular tests, but most often they're getting it as a PDF and they're just pulling out the key insights and putting that in a chart in a text field or a note field or an observation table that we can pull out for you. From this table, ejection fraction, stroke risk score, 6-minute walk, QT, a lot of these, it's almost exclusively, it's a non-zero capture in the structured field, but it's a tremendous amount higher capture once you go a little bit broader and look into the notes. And this gets better over time. We're seeing better capture of lipid panels as therapies get better, and unfortunately, probably due to some prior auth requirements, we're seeing better capture in the structured fields to go along with the NLP uptick. So what we then do is, if you go back a couple slides when I had all the massive bullets, we're not boiling the ocean. We're being very methodical on what we pick to tackle next. And what we then do is kind of group the enhanced elements in the underlying diagnoses that map into therapeutically focused data sets and pair it up with other structured underlying data that we know about those patients. So I'm spoiled. I get to play in the full universal sandbox there. But what we try to do to support folks using this and researchers using this is to carve it into meaningful, internally coherent chunks of data for researchers, generally organized kind of around a specific diagnosis set or pharmaceutical indication. So you don't have to wrestle through the whole database if you just care about autoimmune, if you just care about cardiovascular, you just care about a subset of cardiovascular. We carve these things out for you and make a nice, neat little bundle for you to work with. We do have projects that cut across all these. One of our gnarliest projects for using NLP on is a safety study around vaccine-associated myocarditis. And it's got a tremendous amount of notes outreach in several different areas simultaneously. It is a 7-year study, so it's allowed to be hard. So we use this for kind of case-by-case, very small sample size. I think our goal sample size there is 300 patients, as well as big kind of below the ocean projects. Luke, and I think we're back to you for the next one.
All right. Yeah, and so basically, we're basically saying that obviously these are better together. The purposes of the databases are different, but you bring them together and you pull out sort of a lot of strengths that are associated with both. The gaps that that can be filled with clinical information can fill in some of the claims that capture sometimes from the ambulatory EMR system, can be helped out with sort of the backbone of the claims databases, depending on the study. You can conduct, sort of much better and much more complete research, given the strengths of both data sets. And so with that, we put together a use case, it's just to kind of show you, not so much in terms of, sort of a validated approach or a validated study, but just some descriptive data that we put together based on some assumptions, so you can see, some of the possibilities, that you can kind of have when combining both of these sources and using the linked databases, using MarketScan and Veradigm together amongst the patients that we have in both data sets. And so with that, and thanks so much to Dave, who's on the analysis team, I think programmer analysis team with Veradigm. Good to see his name, and thanks so much for his efforts if he's listening. But we put together this use case with a population really of adults with continuous enrollment and EMR activity, EHR activity, I should say, in 2022. So we looked at a kind of a precise piece of time where we knew we had enrollment, we had activity, so that people would be in both the claims and the EHR sets. We looked at annual healthcare costs, because again, that's coming from the claims, from MarketScan. We thought that was a good thing to take a look at. And we looked at lots of different covariates, bringing in some demographics and sort of the expanded demographic characteristics that you can bring in from the EHR set, as well as clinical characteristics. Some you could probably get from claims, but most, for sure, you really need the EHR data set to really take a look at and to open up the possibilities. Until what Mac was talking about in the prior slides reminded me of, when people are looking at, a lot of our life sciences clients have to look at new areas and, sort of new ways to use drugs or develop drugs and so forth. And a lot of times, the coding's not there, to support that. So you have to basically look at really new and unique data sources like Veradigm to get at, some of the segments of the population where your opportunities are, where your unmet need is. And so it's basically what we're doing here. And what I like about how these are laid out is that it brings together lots of use cases where you can kind of see where, okay, well, you can use a diagnosis code perhaps for that, or perhaps you have to lean on the SNOMED codes a little bit from EHR to, sort of your vital signs and your blood and urine tests and some of the other cases where you need EHR. That's structured data, so that's nice to have. And then we have some use cases where you actually have to go into NLP and pull it out for yourself. You have to create a structured variable, basically, is really what you're doing. Because you don't have one yet to assess, some of the differences in the outcomes in some of the areas that you're looking at. So I thought it was a pretty neat way to put this together. We have the NLP-derived clinical measures kind of circled, as you'll see. And thanks again to Dave. So I'll take a look at the first couple slides, and obviously Mac should be commenting on this as well. But you can kind of see we just put some some basic descriptives, so you can see kind of those first three graphs. So, I should say the first two on the top, the first one on the bottom. Really you could get that from claims, right? And so you can kind of see, get an idea. Obviously, it's can be supplemented with some information from the EHR source where it's missing, but your overall cost, your cost by gender, and your cost by age, you see it directionally, it's looking pretty good. You wouldn't expect necessarily to see big differences in gender, but age you probably would, and it's good to see that in terms of some validation. What the great thing about Veradigm is it brings in a lot of possibilities for race, ethnicity. So you can kind of see that. You can look at costs according to each category of race that we have, and then it's good to see on the BMI, looking at vital signs again. Something that's not really, you get a little bit of that from the claims with some ICD-10 diagnosis codes these days, but oftentimes it's missing on quite a few patients, especially if you're only looking across one calendar year like we are here. And so you see that that costing sort of distribution is increasing as people or the categories of BMI increase, which is what you'd expect to see. I want to make sure Matt gets a chance to comment on this if he wants to. Otherwise, I'll.
No, I think you covered it nicely. It's picking a metric it's just a playing in the sandbox. We're not going to be writing any JAMA papers off of this, but it's picking a sandbox to play in and show you some of the depth and stuff we can look at together.
Yeah, sure. Oh, okay. Great. Okay. And then we looked at some clinical measures. So again, we looked at, sort of a ASCVD diagnosis, and as expected, it's a little bit, I wouldn't, again, go and use these results because, again, we're looking at a 1-year time frame. These events are happening likely in that same time frame, versus patients who are not having those events, mainly, survivable MIs, strokes, things like that you capture as part of that diagnosis. But again, it's showing, directionally, it's definitely going the right way. You can kind of combine those two, which is nice to see. The next ones are sort of some of the more, the more kind of run-of-the-mill EHR measures that you can get from the blood and urine tests, and vital.
And I think where I'm going to pick it up and kind of bring it home so we can spend some good time in discussion is, we've talked a little bit about these NLP, what they provide.
Kind of keep it in control. But anyways, you can kind of see the possibilities that you have in terms of,
did you lose my audio? I'm sorry, do you still have me?
We do, yeah, I hear you now.
Oh, I apologize. Sorry about that.
We got okay. I didn't know if you wanted to comment, yeah. So anyway, so the again, you can get at the vital signs with the diastolic blood pressure as part of that Veradigm data, as well as the sort of your standard kind of panel blood and urine tests, which is kind of where your LDL comes from, and you can look at costs, sort of across the time frame. Controlling for confounding factors, you might see another result or another design, but it's great to see that you can actually conduct this, research and answer questions along those lines with the combined data set. And then what's really cool is the Veradigm team was able to pull in a couple of variables. Really, these are, again, these are tests, but these are really specialized tests, that people undergo, I think, as who perhaps have a family history of the disease or showing signs of of cardiovascular disease in some way. And you can kind of, these were pulled, specifically by NLP, brought in, structured to variables. And then, we did that cost analysis. And so basically you can look at the ApoB results in terms of and stratify by costs, as well as the specialized LPA test that's done a lot of times when someone shows like a family history, basically, of cardiovascular disease. People are looking at that. And so you can kind of see the numbers there. And you see a nice trend. Again, the people who are lower, perhaps those are people who have that, perhaps being controlled a lot more or using a lot of resources, sort of healthcare utilization and costs associated with keeping those values down. But for the most part, these graphs look really good as expected. So it's great to see that you're able to kind of pull this in, and it's very valuable for our clients basically to be able to use the data set, knowing that you can get some of these variables structured in for specialized analysis. I don't know if Mac, if you have any other comments to that one.
Yeah, I got a couple of slides. I'd like to dig into some of these in a little more detail, but you're spot on. This is where the two together is better. So we picked ASCVD because that's something that you can largely get from claims. It's a big categorization of, do you have one of these diagnoses? Have you had one of these procedures? It's a pretty black and white definition, but it's extremely broad. So within that, can we start to apply some of these clinical and NLP elements just to show the range within that broad categorization of, you've got an ASCVD diagnosis. So it's this additional depth and these additional dimensions that I think is exciting and fun to play with here. I mean, obviously, if you have ASCVD, you're going to be more expensive, but not all of that is equal. What's the relationship across the different patient subgroups? So here we just show BMI and race, but I will say on the left-hand side, it's pretty rare that something behaves that nicely, that cleanly. On the right-hand side is a little more what you'd expect to see, a different nonlinear pattern. But what's the role of BMI in healthcare costs and resource utilization? BMI is a modifiable event, especially with GLP-1s. It's a modifiable clinical measure. How much of this is, your BMI-related costs is directly driven by ASCVD status, and vice versa? Does it differ by any of the other categories that Luke talked about or I talked about? Like, what are the different dimensional analyses you can do on this? And even though we qualitatively expected this, there's always value in quantifying these things, putting in benchmarks as we move forward and get better. ARPA-H is a fantastic organization. They have a huge program right now. They're looking for proposals on reducing ASCVD risk score in populations, and they're using our data as a benchmark to say, did an area improve? How much did they improve? We need to publish and get these clinically deep benchmarks out there so we can track improvement. And then, Luke, you did hit on kind of the more exciting ones of Lipo-A and ApoB. I do want to call out one of my colleagues, Jana Angela-Sky, who's done a lot of work digging into these and helping really drive these as a priority item at Veradigm, but then also doing some really cool work correlating these to kind of more commonly captured measures. And what we're seeing is, and what we truly believe is, if we can do more research on these, we will make it easier and more accessible for clinicians and HCPs to capture it routinely in the data. So by pulling it out of the notes and showing that it's of value for patient management and for research, we can then change the data collection process to make it easier, make them more encouraged to capture it themselves. If you go to ACC or AHA, this is half of the presentations, and Jana's really been on our side at the forefront of pushing this as a priority and pushing this as a development activity, so you can start to pull into these depth. I'm sure she disagrees with the categories we used here, but it's really just illustrative of the depth you can get, and can we show, throw this up against 3, 4, 5 other variables, throw it into a model, and then you've got a story. So that's a paper you should be on the lookout for. But again, here we're just presenting some real simple characteristics, split the patients for description, but keeping in mind, we've picked 3 variables here. Do you have an ASCVD diagnosis, yes or no? Did you have an APO? Did you have a lipo? Your total costs. If you go way back up to the top, when you have the boxes and the figures with the 2 different colors, everything in any of those boxes is there. It's fair game. It's in the same sandbox. It's a really neat, fun. It's both a deep and a wide sandbox to play in, where you can work with really simple measures, but also some of these really gnarly, innovative, cutting-edge measures that are going to only matter more kind of as we go forward. So that I did want to leave, and I think we did succeed, Luke, in leaving ample time for questions and discussion. I know, Lisa, I think you're up for that, but I don't know, Luke, if you've got any parting comments. Otherwise, I think we've got what looks like a good set of questions to go through.
Yeah, a lot of questions.
So I will go ahead and get that kicked off then. So one of the questions relates to validation, and I'm wondering, Luke or Mac, I think the NLP version might be more of a Mac, but Luke, feel free to chime in. When we think about validation, there's sort of, in my mind, there's sort of two approaches, one of which is, what, if anything, is done during the NLP curation process to validate, sort of where we started and where we ended in terms of the validation of the NLP, from the notes to the curated data. And then you also mentioned, as it relates, you sort of mentioned the use of these data for safety work, safety analyses and things of that nature. And so maybe we can also comment on validation as it relates to the types of activities that we might use these data for in terms of, from the regulatory context. So under the umbrella of validation, could one or both of you sort of take those questions?
I have a lot to say about this. Luke, I don't know if you want to comment first before I get long-winded.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of the linkage itself, and I did see a question about how the data is linked. Maybe I'll cover a little bit of that before you dive into the NLP stuff. But, this is linked via Datavant tokens, so the claims and the EHR information is linked in that way. But I'm going to let Mac really handle a lot of the base of the question, which has to do with NLP validation. I can think of ways to do it, but I'm sure that Mac's team has it covered.
Yeah, and I'm going to say we tend to be risk averse and conservative here, and that we hold pretty high standards for accuracy. So when I mentioned high tech and high touch, this is the high touch. So our data scientists are a dual team of clinicians. So most of them are nurses. So Jordan Overcash, who leads that group, is a nurse and a data scientist, which is a really tough position to fill. But it's so that we can look at concrete examples to say, does this clinically make sense? Does it fit the clinical definition that it's supposed to? And then you do it in a test set, you launch it on a full sample. So it's depending on what the clinical context is. I mean, the bare minimum of accuracy is 90%. There's some spots where if it's a safety thing, like if we're talking about anaphylaxis, you might require 95%, something higher than that. But it's generally, if we're doing this as a custom development in NLP on behalf of a client, we would set expectations and we would describe, here's how we're doing it. Here's where our thresholds are. Are you comfortable? Are you comfortable with those thresholds? For safety analyses, what we have to try to do is provide the audit trail that what we show in our data is as close to, if not exactly, what the clinician put in. Where it gets a little bit tricky is if we're putting it in like a case adjudication platform, we then have to show the audit trail. The case adjudication platform being like something that sits a little bit on top of our data that might have multiple things into it. Those audit trails are a little bit trickier, but we have to be able to draw a line back from what the case adjudication folks can see, who are saying, is this a safety event, yes or no, back to the root data. When that happens, I will say a big caveat is if it's an FDA mandated activity, there's different HIPAA requirements. And sometimes we might be able to use PHI for some of that auditing. I would set that aside. That doesn't really apply to the NLP approach, but if we have to be able to show data fidelity for a safety signal, because we have the core root raw data, we can do that if we have to. Not really what we talked about today. I could spend an hour talking just about that, but I think we'll probably take the next question instead.
Great. So, so I know we focused on cardiovascular disease and, sort of the value around, specifically to cardiovascular disease. Another sort of two-part question, right, which is kind of from the lengthy list of measures that you showed us. Where do you really see the value of the NLP enrichment? Is it to better categorize and classify patients with cardiovascular disease, or whatever the diseases are that we're using inserting, or do you see these NLP based variables as being more of the outcome variables or something other?
I mean, I could start that. I think it's both for sure. I think that I was sort of trying to get at that. That's a very good question. It's better put than probably what I did earlier. But I think at the end of the day, when you have a requirement, to sort of dig into the notes to find this information, whether it be cardiovascular disease or really any condition, where you need something that's not really structured, whether it be in claims, whether it be might not be structured, perhaps to even a LOINC code at this point. If you go back some ways, this stuff isn't automatically coded to LOINC codes, sort of in these systems. Really the use of NLP can be for that. Sometimes that can be your outcome of interest if you're interested in a very specific, condition. Sometimes it can be, sort of a way to apply some clinical control or to get severity of a certain disease. Oftentimes it's used, sort of a case, this information on ASCVD is a good example. On the flip side of that, you could look at chronic kidney disease, which is pretty much staged in claims and has been for decades. So it just depends on what condition you're looking at, to get at this. But I think it can be a predictor, it can be an outcome, all of the above.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, some of these are lend themselves to either really nicely, like you think about like your LDL or HDL. That's something you could see it as a way to categorize patients, but it's also obviously a huge outcome if you're doing a PCSK9 or ezetimibe or bempedoic acid, one of those kinds of analyses. You've got other things, particularly the NASH-related outcomes, 4 or FibroScan results, those types of things, which could again be either how do you classify your patients, how do you case mix and adjust your patients at baseline, or an outcome. So I'd say it's obviously the uses are protocol driven and context specific, but absolutely both. We're seeing it probably slightly more towards categorizing patients than outcomes, but that could just be the mix of work my crew's seeing now. It's pretty firmly both.
So we had a number of questions that I'm going to put under the umbrella of like sort of practical questions that relate specifically to the years of data that the LINC database covers, what researchers might want to consider as it relates to the timing of the data availability vis-a-vis when the service or activity occurred. So I guess data lag. What kind of volume overall are we talking about? Can one of you sort of elaborate on that? And I think the other one that came through relates to, we're talking about this being sort of an NLP-enhanced version of the LINC data. When is that available, and what, will it be specific to certain therapeutic areas, or will it cover, sort of all the areas that have been curated up until now? So a lot packed under there, and I don't know, Luke, maybe if you want to take the years and the lag and the volume, and then Mac can speak to the therapeutic area.
Yeah, I'll take the easy part again. No, just kidding. So right now we're at 2018 to present. From what I understand, we're going to be having about 9 million patients, a little over 9 million patients in this data set with our current version. The clinical folks, Mac's team, they have EHR data out, probably the day after it shows up to them. No, I'm just kidding. It's very, very recent. They can update things very, very frequently. On the claims side, MarketScan is a fully adjudicated closed claims database. I like to say people squabble about who's paying for a little while before the claims start to settle. And so they tend to be, so Mac's team is kind of waiting for us really to update it. And so right now I know we have this on an annual basis. I think we're also offering it as a standard quarterly update basis. And so basically, that does come with, some lag, but it's all really due to the claims. And I also believe the versions have the most complete clinical data in it, even if the claims, have about a 7 or 8 month lag in them. So that's kind of what you're looking at there. And I think I answered all of that, Lisa, or perhaps there was another part of that.
There was. Yeah, before we switch it over to sort of the Mac versions, there's some questions really around the kind of what we're characterizing as completeness.
Oh, yeah.
And so maybe we can just sort of like do just a refresh of some ways about sort of when we talk about complete, what that means for, say, both sides of the the value proposition in terms of both data sources.
Sure.
And then sort of we can look back to talk about sort of the NLP side of the linked data.
Yeah, sounds great. So I think, in terms of the completeness of the MarketScan claims, I mean, we feel like we have a claims product that's kind of second to none. And it goes back to the sourcing. So keep in mind this data is being, the individual contributors to MarketScan, they're getting databases that characterize basically, sort of their line of business in terms of their large self-insured employers. They want to know, sort of all aspects of what's happening from a claims perspective to their employees and their families. And, whether it's cost effective, they're looking at reimbursement benchmarks to what they're paying for some of the services. They're doing all kinds of other things in terms of quality of care and benefits, sort of assessments. And so we get very, very complete information. We get carve-out information where most claims products don't. As I mentioned, it's a closed system claims perspective. So we get, sort of that full linked medical and pharmacy claims database with monthly enrollment records. But just keep in mind, this isn't, we're not sort of using the exhaust from some other process to create this claims database. The database is actually being created by really a bunch of research grade databases that are put together for these companies. So we feel it's very complete. And then I'll let Mac, I guess, talk about the NLP side.
Yeah. So as I lead into that, Mac, just I think one of the other things that I would mention is that in the creation of this database, and one of the reasons why initially we focused on a initially short period and are extending that out, is because we did want to make sure that we were looking at a smaller amount of temporal time to ensure that there was mutual activity. So claims happening, and that there was activity sort of in the EMR side, so that you didn't have 10 years of claims followed by only 10 years of EMR activity, and that the overlap, of those two is sort of very tightly related temporally. And I think that then leads into, Mac, the questions about, sort of the selection of the NLP enrichment and, sort of what that looks like for, sort of the products that we're releasing and what therapeutic areas, the teams are focusing on.
So, and thank you both for those insights. I think it's all spot on. I think we're trying to carve out digestible, I think I referred to it as internally coherent kind of chunks of data or TAs that people can work with. So yes, if you want the whole thing, you can get the whole thing, or if you want just a specific subset within cardiovascular and then the NLP that goes around that. And everything you said about the lags is true. EHR data, we're extremely spoiled. It refreshes very quickly. We have some sources that you get a nightly feed. That's really important for safety, trigger-related safety event kind of work. But for this work, having a little bit longer lag where we're waiting to do the refresh on claims does let us refresh the NLP models, so that when we're linking to data that's 9 months, I think a year is about where we're going now, is we can rerun all of our models and refresh to make sure we have the latest and the greatest in there. I think I mentioned the problem. If you run a model once, you run a model once. We kind of reassess them a couple times a year for some of the older metrics, but every time we get fresh data, we're running the models through to get additional pickup. But EHR data is pretty darn complete pretty quickly. But I think for how we carve out...
Yeah, for the NL, and what if anything does the NLP, sort of add, like you said, like you've run the models once. I like the example you gave, which is that the high touch part is, you don't want to just look for the word COVID and be like, COVID, they have COVID. You're really looking for the context to make sure that it's is it like, I'm afraid of COVID, or is it I had COVID, or is it my spouse had COVID, right? So like the high touched around the context of the words, what does that, if anything, add to your, sort of that process?
Well, I mean, to be totally honest, most of those are happening in a research question-driven environment, not I want to ship you a huge cut of data so you can answer 50 questions. Where we're looking at that kind of context, think about what we're trying to replace and optimize is a replacement for a chart review, right? We're trying to replace a manual chart review where you have to read 10,000 10,000 notes on 500 patients to get the meaning out of it. So that's where our NLP is, where we are doing a lot of spot checking, a lot of case reviews. For a lot of these metrics, there's not quite as much worry about data hallucinations or misclassification. Like we know what an ejection fraction should look like now. We know what a t-score should look like now. It's really just making sure, looking at what got left on the floor, looking at all the times. It's not just looking for ejection fraction and all the different ways you can spell it or misspell it. There's some fancy term for all the different misspellings. It's really cool stuff in all the different wildcards. It's looking to see what hit that trigger but didn't classify to get us a value at the end of it, and see, are there any systematic changes to it? Sometimes we have a single practice or provider or group of providers that changes over time, and we suddenly see things that hit that flag that looks like we should get a value, we don't get a value. So you want to go back and pull 100 records there to say, okay, did something systematically change? Are they categorizing it differently, or are they categorizing it better? We suddenly get an uptick. So that's where the high touch is, just being, running your data quality reports and fanatically, meticulously going over them. But I do take a lot of confidence in it's because this is capturing the clinical care. It has to be accurate from the physician's perspective. They need it to be accurate to provide patient care. So what we're getting is what the care is being provided based on. So we just have to check for kind of trends in our models, or any shifts in our models going forward.
And so it sounds like, and I'm going by memory now, like the therapeutic areas that are curated right now, sort of, you've got cardiovascular, neurology, mental health. There's probably some others that I'm not remembering. And that would be available in sort of the off-the-shelf version of the product. But the value, and I think maybe going back to one of the things that you talked about as a result of being the originators on both the MarketScan side and the Veradigm side, the originators of the data, is that the more customized, I am interested in X. There were questions, for example, about using the linked data for, pregnancy studies and validating birth defects. And so the ability to go back, even if they're not in the off-the-shelf version of the product, and speak to you, that's like a functionality of being the originators, and it's a value story around the originators.
Yeah, you as a user who's interested, or as a potential user who's interested in this, you have the ability to influence the development queue. It's like, we have no trouble convincing ourselves that we're really smart. We love to hear from people who say, have you thought about this? And trust that we will tell you if we thought about it, it didn't work. Trust that we'll tell you what it won't support. But we really welcome those dialogues. We try to keep an eye on the clinical conferences. We try to keep an eye on what's coming next. What's the drug development pipeline, to see where should we develop next. But nothing beats hearing from a researcher who's got a question that's keeping them up at night that they can't solve, and talking through if there's something we can throw the clinical depth at to solve. But yeah, if you have any questions, please reach out. We'll inundate you with counts and discussions.
So I'm glad you mentioned counts, because that was going to be sort of my parting note. Counts are obviously available. We've got counts underlying the research that was presented today. But if people are interested in counts for what it would mean for, or interested in whether the NLP-enhanced version of the linked data set will include metrics or measures that they're particularly interested in, reach out to either your Veradigm team or your MarketScan team, and we would be happy to put that together following this presentation. I know we only have about a minute and 10 seconds left, so I'd like to thank Luke and Mac and our audience for participating with us today. And I will turn it back over to Alex from Global Data.
That is great. Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to Mac and Luke for your excellent presentations today. That just leaves me to thank everyone who watched today and everyone who took part as a panelist. To the attendees, thank you for joining us. Tomorrow you will receive an email to say how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar, or you can access it through the website arenainternational.com/events. Please continue to ask questions and interact with the widgets, as this on-demand version of this event will remain interactive. The speakers can provide you a written response directly, as well as those who submitted questions today, but we unfortunately didn't have time for. Thank you once again, and I hope to see you on another webinar.
Thank you. Be well.